Good evening, everyone. We've still got a few coming in, but I think we're going to make a start. I'm Peter Millack from the Institute of Architects, the Victorian Chapter President, and on behalf of the Victorian Chapter, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to the 2015 Gold Medal Address. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight, the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong. Melbourne is the traditional meeting place where the fresh water meets the salt water, and we pay the greatest respect to their elders past and present. With us tonight, we have some of our own elders: Greg Burgess, Graham Gunn, Darryl Jackson, and we're waiting on but will find Peter McIntyre, all previous gold medal winners. Can we have a round of applause for them, please? Can I also acknowledge our past National President, Shelley Penn, and current National President, John Clements. And also a welcome to all the previous chapter presidents and chapter councillors. Tonight's event is held in partnership with the University of Melbourne School of Design, and I'd like to ask the Acting Dean of the Faculty, Darryl LeGroux, to say a few words. Thanks, Darryl.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. I'm not quite amongst the elders yet, but almost. Welcome to the University of Melbourne. Welcome to the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning and the Melbourne School of Design. I do apologise that we're not meeting in our wonderful faculty building. The next time we kind of guarantee that we'll block out a section of time to make sure that this event occurs in our homeland. Many of you will, of course, remember, as I do, starting my course in architecture in the old Air Force huts down on the Grattan Street, at the Grattan Street gates. And then, of course, we kind of remember well and truly how Brian Lewis inveigled the university to create a new building. That's gone on for a long period of time under various incarnations, and of course we now have a wonderful John Wardle building. Isn't it great that there's an academician who is a gold medal winner as well as a practitioner? And I say that because it's not that long ago that disciplines like architecture and the fine arts, landscape architecture, urban design, even urban planning were not really seen as being part of a university curriculum, let alone being included in the research profile of the university. It's fantastic now to know that that research practitioners and educators can be counted as equal, with a parity of steam within the university, and that architectural practice, along with art practice, dance practice, performing arts practice, and so on, is now recognised as the equivalent of any kind of research within the university. And that's true because it represents work of the highest quality in the discipline. It represents an extension of knowledge and a creation of new knowledge. And it represents a capacity for the judgment of peers, for the peer review. And when you put those three things together and you apply them to any discipline, then you have a basis for including that discipline within the great research traditions of the 1,000-year-old university since the University of Bologna. It meets all the conditions of the Charter. So it's great to see Peter Stutchbury succeed in such an environment, in the environment of practice and in the environment of the academy. And when you put those two together, you have the basis for a wonderful extension of our great profession into the future. So welcome everybody from the point of view of the faculty. Welcome to Peter, welcome to my peers and all of your peers. And I'm sure we're going to enjoy hearing what Peter has to say tonight. Thank you.
Now, one more formality. The Gold Medal Tour is sponsored by our principal corporate partner, BlueScope, which is a partnership that goes back 30 years, all the way back to the old days of BHP. And with us tonight from BlueScope are Braden Liner and Mike Brinkman. Mike's going to say a few words.
What I'm really hoping for in the next 30 years of architecture is a really broadening of the role of architect. The quality of what we do, going beyond looks fabulous is sustainable to looks fabulous is sustainable, incredibly effective and contributes enormously to society.
We are available to sit on committees. I doubt that there's many architects with a creative background to their thinking that sit on these committees that decide about things like Barangaroo.
I'd really like to see, in fact, the building industry incentivised for green building. There's just not enough incentive. It's too cheap to build not green, and I think that's something we have to address, I would say, in the next 5 years.
I think a really responsible education system is important in architecture.
Culture moves forward by taking risk. So risk is something that we don't take a cavalier approach to, but something that we take a very measured approach to.
Risk-taking isn't form. Risk-taking is approach. It's experimentation.
You can't innovate without taking risk. It's like the old turn the page upside down idea. That's a risk in a way, to look at something completely differently and risk giving up something that you thought was critical because you found a better way through.
Good evening, and on behalf of BlueScope, welcome. 2015 marks a significant milestone for both the Institute and BlueScope. As Peter mentioned, we're in our 30th year of celebrating as principal corporate partner with the Institute. The strength of this partnership is evident, that despite the economic and financial challenges that our business has faced in recent years, our relationships with the Institute and the industry have been prioritised. BlueScope are very proud supporters of the Institute's major events, and we continue to support the advancement of architecture in Australia, including the Institute's Gold Medal, the highest honour to a practising professional that the Institute can bestow. Peter's 34 years in practice has delivered a truly outstanding body of work. The jury's commentary succinctly summarises Peter's ability to create architecture that speaks of the place it inhabits, buildings that are environmentally sustainable, culturally specific, and locally embedded. A look at Peter's celebrated projects immediately reflects this skill and reaffirms Peter's significant and lasting contribution to our built environment. However, Peter's contribution to architecture extends far deeper than the projects that we have seen recognised with awards. Peter's contribution to the advancement of architecture through teaching and providing a social voice for the industry are equally valid reasons to be celebrating Peter's remarkable career this evening. Tonight's presentation provides us all with the opportunity to congratulate Peter and acknowledge his unquestionable and distinguished service to the profession. Peter, on behalf of BlueScope, a sincere congratulations on being the 2015 gold medalist, and to all here tonight, please accept our very best wishes for a thoroughly enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce Peter. I've got a long speech which I'm not going to read. What I will say is Peter will illustrate to you that the rock you build on or the tree you're building next to and the materials you have at hand are really just as important as the form or the shape or the ideas of the building. He's a great guy. His feet are truly in the dirt, but his head's in the stars. It's his first speech in Melbourne, apart from his acceptance of the award earlier this year, and I'd really like you to give him a big Melbourne welcome, the 2015 gold medalist, Peter Stutchbury.
So I had to win a gold medal to get a talk in Melbourne. Pretty tough, eh? Distinguished gold medalists, what a wonderful thing to sit in a pew with these guys. Hey? Greg, dear friend, John and Cameron, great mates, and thank you all for coming. An unexpected joy. I've got to be a little bit quicker than last night because we've got drinks later. This is me with a kangaroo. And I'd like you to hold this image in your head for the rest of the talk. Because as a kid growing up, I spent a lot of time in Western New South Wales in the desert, semi-arid desert. And this was a pet kangaroo. It lived in a hessian bag on the back, thanks Philip, lived in a hessian bag on the back of the laundry door. We used to lift it into the hessian bag. We used to watch it rub the back of its ears as it cooled itself down. We used to watch it balance itself on its back tail, etc., etc. Aboriginal, and I should pay respect, as was done earlier, to the elders and the traditional custodians of this land. I think it's a very important thing that we should do at the start of every talk or every conference or every discussion we have, so that we become more and more aware of that. Aboriginal map of Australia, which we've probably all seen, but a great map of the sustainability of Australia, because most of these countries, these Aboriginal countries, are about the same number of people, roughly. And so the denser countries, the smaller ones, were where the land was sustainable, and the lighter ones, the bigger the ones in the middle where the desert is. So it's a great map of Australia, quite different to these maps of Australia, which are the whitefella maps of Australia, which were our first mistake, because they're based on agriculture and mining. This is a aerial Google of Australia, Central Australia. That's 1,000 kilometres of sand dunes. And that's Willie Changera's painting of it, painted from the feet, through the body, through the soul. Quite different to the white man's painting of something, feeling versus seeing. So again, I'm trying to recognise what the essential differences are and what made those differences or what created those differences. And that's an honest plight. We, as a culture, we find it quite easy to go camping. Bermagui, no matter where it is, we go there and we find great ease after a day or two. We don't worry about making a fire. We don't worry about sleeping in a swag as long as there's more than 2 or 3 people so you feel secure. And we do it quite easy. And this little billy can down here was made by a farmer out of a spoke from a windmill, and he just swung it across onto the fire and swung it back. Great innovation. Our early houses were pretty cool as well. Cool in a real sense. They had verandas, they had ventilation, they had simple things that made the buildings work. But somehow we inherited this sort of Englishness to our thinking. And it sort of has persuaded our thinking for a long time ever since. And I guess I'm asking the question, is it appropriate thinking for this country? Because, you know, it's getting to a point now where it's frigging ridiculous. You know, a homage to the car, a west-facing building in Sydney that relies entirely on air conditioning for comfort. Doesn't make sense to me. And our cities could be great power stations, couldn't they? If they were photovoltaic windows or cells, if they were designed as heat chimneys, they could be powering a whole place. In fact, Newcastle University and Newcastle region developed that solar collector, which is a mirror, which can, in 50 acres, can power a whole city. And yet the government won't get behind it. I've just got back from a wonderful trip teaching, but the last place we stayed was in the Hakka villages, the Toulon buildings in southern China. One of the great community buildings of the world. Top 2 floors are family houses, about 4 by 4, with a big veranda where you can come out and sit down and talk to people. First floor is where all the food is stored, away from the animals, away from the rodents. And the lower ground floor are all the kitchens with a central temple. I think, a great sort of understanding of culture at large and of people and of living. Initially based on security, but also based on community and sharing. And now this is what we get in China. This was a photograph taken from the car going to the airport after living in one of these for 4 days. So I believe the whole psychology of the world has taken a radical turn from this sort of stuff. And you may look at this and say, well, you know, we're not going to live like that anymore, and we aren't. It would be ridiculous to live like that, but the principles of how you live like that are interesting. We actually didn't build shelter to a degree. In Victoria, I think we had possum skins over a dome, and in Northern Territory, you lifted yourself off the ground to get away from the mosquitoes because you lit a fire and the crocodiles. But, you know, for 50,000 years we lived like that, or the Aboriginal people did. And I'm not saying you're going to live like that, but I mean, it's an interesting provocation, isn't it? I think it is. And this is how Central Australian Aborigines live at the moment. So they have tents and they throw them in the back of the ute and they go to another site and they shoot kangaroos and they live off the land. And this is how they live also in Alice Springs. The house in the background is the one that the white fella has provided, the government has provided, and the beds in the foreground is how they want to live. So we're still getting, I think something's wrong. We farmed the land, but we didn't think about how we were farming land. Our land's the oldest land in the world, oldest continent in the world. The topsoil is hardly existent. So when you farm it with a hard-hoofed animal, you destroy it. Our own farm, which is, we cropped it for this is Western District, New South Wales, we cropped it for 2 years. The third year it wouldn't take a crop. 3 years. Topsoil in Europe is like 40 foot deep. Topsoil in Australia is 4 inches deep. Another mistake. Environment Minister Greg Hunt has reassured farmers in the Liverpool Plains, which is the richest country in New South Wales - Australia, and drains to the Darling River via the Nomi River. So it's a very vibrant country and was the original grasslands of New South Wales. It was the original bread bed of New South Wales, or bread basket of New South Wales. And that the strictest conditions have been put into place to ensure ugly, noisy wind turbines do not blemish the new 35 square kilometre open cut coal mine planned for the area, owned by the Chinese, not even owned by us. So this is no good, but this is fine. And you know what? We, including me, all sit back and go, yeah, no worries. Mum and Dad. And I don't think you can do a talk like this without acknowledging your parents, surely. Unless you had a tough time like that comedian who was on Australian Story the other night. But even he acknowledged his parents. Mum on the left-hand side, one comment of hers when I said, why did you take us to the country so often, to the family properties? She said, I wanted you to have the knowledge of the city, but the truth of the country. And one of Dad's best sayings, he was an engineer, was, if you're going to do it well and do it once. This was the family home on the Lane Cove River. And I show it because that back left-hand room on the family house was a room that Dad designed and built called the sunroom. And I suspect we spent 80% of our time in the sunroom. And I suspect the sunroom is a good model for the Australian house. And that's where I learned it. I think when I found this photo like 2 or 3 years ago, I thought, actually, that sunroom is a great model for how you live. We had the piano in it, we had divans in it where all the kids slept, we had all the parties in it. It opened up on that back porch, there was a toilet in the backyard, etc., etc. But we also had holidays like we all do, I guess you guys do too, and we learnt about We learnt firsthand about how things are patterned or how things are made. We learnt that, you know, water creates certain things, but I'm only showing this as a specific sort of learning process, not a specific example. We know that those little baubles are made by these little things. And if you wanted to, you could go in. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that wonderful image where they go into the universe and then they go back into a singular module, and it's the same system, macro to micro. This is where the family property was. In that, you know, look at that country. It's desperate country. How can we possibly? And you can see where you can't actually just see on the right-hand side there where the actual farming ceases, and this is all leased land. But we're between two ranges, the Jackamaroo Range and the Shuttleton Range. So we're a valley, but, you know, an old valley. So the ranges are only 600 metres high. Very susceptible country, but incredibly beautiful. And country that we need to respect all around Australia. We have the second highest amount of natural virgin country in the world, 40%, behind Antarctica. And this is a house I found on the property once, age about 20, and no, older than that, age 24. And I suspected the Aborigines had lived on the property because we have these wonderful ranges, 9 of them that come out of the landscape. And there's a natural spring in the ranges, which is unusual for out there. And I thought, well, Aboriginal people had to live here. And I pulled in under that rock ledge and I looked up and I saw that hand stencil above my head. And I assure you, the feeling I had was quite incredible to think that people had been there 1,200 years earlier and lived there and survived there and hunted there and bred there and worked there and been there. And of course you'd ask yourself the question, well, we can't do that now, that's not how we are. But there are principles, I think, which are really important. And I think it's the principles that we're leaving behind. So that's the house. You can see the scale down the right-hand side there. But that's where they lived, that was their house, all around Australia. That's the house we were brought up with in the country. It was built by my great-uncle. 2 army huts made in T-section, northern veranda, water court off the ground, water court off the roof for drinking, slow combustion stove for cooking and heating, pit toilet, diesel generator, kerosene fridge, totally off the grid for all my sort of early years. I never knew that. I never sort of realised that at the time, but that was what I was being taught. And we could only shower, we could only bath, we didn't shower, we could only bath once every 3 or 4 days because there wasn't enough water. We had 4 inches of water that we could bath in and there was 3 or 4 of us, and so, you know, you took it in turns because by the time you were there number 4, the water was really dirty. So I learnt early on that water is one of our biggest, if not our biggest resource in this country. And I think our second biggest resource is food. And I think that those 2 things alone are going to be incredibly demanded in about 10 years' time. So anyone that's got a farm with good soil, keep it. And that's down below is how we live there now when we visit. So that's my daughter in her bedroom. That's the kitchen and the living area. And it's fine. And that's how I educated the kids in the landscape when I was there or when we were there. 3 kids, Bronte, who's an environmental engineer now, and Noah, who's just finished his first degree in architecture, and Cleopatra, who I don't know what she's going to do. That's the property, that's the drawers that I'm talking about where the Aboriginal cave was. But you can see on the left-hand side how flat and sort of desolate it is. And we look at these places and we go to, you know, we go to Chartres Cathedral in France, which is wonderful, but we have our own Chartres Cathedral in this country. And to the right-hand side, if you look to the right of that image there, is this here. And I realised very early on that I borrowed from the landscape in my architecture. And if you look at that little perspective up there, that's this wonderful long promenade of a ramp that goes down through the landscape. And if you approach it at one end, you walk up it, you don't even realise that you're climbing. And you walk out onto this escarpment and you're 100 metres above the ground, 80 metres above the ground. It's wonderful. And I used that in a building, which I'll show you. But when I used it, I didn't realise that I was using it. The trees, these trees just here, are typical desert trees. You can see they're growing where the water comes off the rock only. You can see they've got a dense foliage, so that shades the ground so the evaporation doesn't happen as much. And you can see they're in V formation, so they catch the water and direct it down to one taproot. There's a real common sense to that tree that says it's a desert tree. And this is how we spend our time out there, usually walking, sometimes on a motorbike, and in early days on horseback. But can you imagine like mustering sheep through this sort of landscape? Tirelessly? It was incredible. And in midday, in summer, you had to pull in under a tree and wait there for an hour or two because it was just too hot. But, you know, in those sort of wonderful periods, you got exposed to the detail of the place. The trapdoor spider, which goes down about 1 metre into the ground so the temperatures are less, and then creates a wonderful little conical hood for its hole that goes into the hole to trap the cool air, but also when it rains, it swells and seals the hole against the water egress. Because the land's so flat, it can't get out of the fall of the water, the lay of the water. And the top image there is Sandy Creek on the property, which borders the property, and the bottom image is Sandy Creek in flood. I've never seen Sandy Creek in flood until 2009. Yet there were frogs in that creek that can survive underground for 7 years. The Aboriginal people don't have 4 seasons like we have in Australia. They have anything between 4 and 11, depending on where it is in the country. A season could be mullet in the river, or it could be acacia flowering. We need to think about our country a bit more, I think. You know, we need to think about whether we want to mine it and whether we want to flog it or whether we want to work with it. This is Gilgaya country, which is the low-lying ground in Western districts. But being the low-lying ground, it's where all the water has filtered down to the Great Artesian Basin, which has 65,000 cubic kilometres of water in it, biggest artesian basin in the world. Its western edge is carbon dated 2 million years old, the water, and its eastern edge 7,000 years old, and it sits on a big sandstone platform. The sky, in this instance, I asked my cousin, so what does that sky mean? Because you can see the sort of the clouds against the cumulonimbus on the upper side there. And he said, oh, it means rain at about midnight, 10 millimetres of rain. Well, it wasn't 10 millimetres rain, it was 8 millimetres rain, it was 1 a.m. So I informed him in the morning that he was wrong. But he knows what he's looking at. He's in touch. He's a farmer. So this is Gilgaya country, and it's where the water lies, so it's where the Aborigines used to camp. But it's also where the minerals lie. So we get a prospector on our land, because for a pound you can get a prospecting licence, and they find 0.2 of a gram of silver for every tonne of earth. And when silver was $46 an ounce, it was profitable to mine that country, so they took out a licence and they got our property for about market price. And this is what they did with it. They took up artesian water from 2 kilometres down. They used arsenic to remove the silver from the ground. And they went bankrupt when the price of silver went down. They left the property like this. 5,000 acres of it. And when I said to my cousin 2 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago, are you going to buy it back? He said, it's worthless. We can't do anything with that country anymore. And this is where the water drains to the high plains. So I can only imagine what's going to happen to all the Mallee country in between Cobar and the Hay Plains now, because there's about 20 of these mines. This is on a brighter note. Everyone's getting a bit solemn, sorry about that. This is where I live. I'm actually building a house just in here, sorry. And that's where I used to live. This is Pittwater, and you talked about the meeting of freshwater and saltwater, very significant area for Aboriginal people here. And this is one of their houses. But before we get to the house, the land in that peninsula was divided up like this. I mean, it's interesting how I was flying over Melbourne today, I was looking down at the houses, and there's no pattern to the houses. I mean, it's not our fault when developers do the patterns. But there's no sort of understanding of how they sit in the landscape. They're just ramshackle all the way. It's the same in Sydney. So the developers come along and just subdivide the land. There's no like subdivision based on topography or sustainability or anything like that. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, fascinates me anyway. So here's the house. It's a beautiful house. It housed about 60 to 70 people for about 10,000 to 12,000 years. It's been carbon dated at. And you can see on the left-hand side there my daughter and her friends. So you can see the scale of this house, and you can see the smoke stain on the ceiling of the house. Fire, of course, is basic to culture. I'm living in a tent at the moment, and we use the fire almost every night to cook. And I'm realising how important it is, a fire. And of course, the other thing that's really important is what I said before, water, fresh water. And there was water in the cave. But also in the cave, at the front of the cave was blueberry ash, which is a vitamin C plant, which someone had planted years ago. And at the top of the cave was a whole area of remedial plants that someone had planted. And it was about half an acre of it. Food and remedial plants. University was good fun. But this is Bells Beach actually, but I used to load the surfboard up in the holidays and go surfing up and down the coast chasing cyclone waves with my mates. I'd work during the term day. I'd usually take half the holidays working, half travelling. But what I was doing was choosing sites, I've realised, and watching weather patterns. And I wasn't doing it on purpose, I was doing it because I love surfing. And so you wouldn't camp in an area that was windblown, you wouldn't camp in an area that's susceptible to drainage problems, you'd find a good camp. And then we went all through Central Australia too, on our way to Western Australia. And for my final year project, I studied Aboriginal people. I lived with them in Wilcannia, which is Western New South Wales on the Darling River, and I built a couple of sheds for them. And the final year presentation, and on the wall they had a high-rise building, a library, a couple of little sheds, another library, and for a while there I thought I was done. But my assessor was a good mate, so we got through. But on this building here, the wall, the wobbly wall, is two things of corrugated iron straight into the dirt with earth in between, which was an experiment. And then the roof is two skins of roof with a batten in between for thermal isolation, but also ventilation. So you just lower the shutters in winter and lift them up in summer. So it was very theoretical and an idea even at that stage. And then when I graduated, I started building stuff. Because Rick LePasteur said, you've got to build Stutch. You've got to go and learn about materials. And I went back to the farm and I built shearers' quarters. And I put wool as the insulation, and I made the beds desks so the kids could use them when the shearers weren't there. And I quoted my cousin $1,242 to build it. And it took me 6 months. And he gave me my $1,242. He said, well done. And he said, and here's a pair of Arm Williams boots as well. I said, thank you, Stuart, that's really kind of you. You turkey. And then I worked for Nielsen Warren and Ken Ma for 2 years. And this is one of the buildings we did, which is the Friado structure, which was a wonderful experience meeting Friado and doing a building, which was an exhibition centre in Hyde Park. And that's Ian Laverick, who runs one of the big heritage architectural firms in London, Peter Ireland, who runs AJC, and myself as the three monkeys. And then I went to Papua New Guinea and I did postgraduate studies on the longhouse. I documented 42 different longhouses, and they take about a week to document, fully document. A lot of those longhouses have been lost now, but what I learned was honesty of structure, honesty of building, all that was necessary in your building, social structure, similar to the hacker houses. So it's communal living. They do have individual houses, but usually what they do with the individual houses is they have them in the garden, so that if your family gets on really well together, you stay in the garden much more than you do in the village. But if you don't get on so good with the missus or the mister, you stay in the village a bit more because men and women are separate. And it works brilliantly. Not like our system. And I learned about a crude structure. So the more you build, the stronger it gets. But I also just learned about honesty, really, and communication, because I had no language, and in the tribes I travelled in, there would have been like 15, 20 different languages. And when they finish a longhouse, and the roof of that longhouse is a two-way curve, incredibly beautiful building. And I looked at it and I thought, who was the architect that came up with that shape? And in fact, it wasn't an architect, it was the wind uplift that came up with that shape. It's the highest wind uplift area in Papua New Guinea. And that roof is like a turtleback and it holds itself down on the ground. And I also went and stayed with the Foy people on Lake Kootaboo. And I woke up one morning and I looked into this room, and the top of the room, which was about 4 metres high, was black lacquer from the smoke, and then it gradually worked its way down to a flat black on the floor, and the light came through the floor of the building. In the morning it was 180 metres long, 140 metres long, it was about 5 metres wide and it had just a door at each end. But the light came through the floor, and it's not a good image, but it was incredibly beautiful. And I realised how beauty can come from something quite simple. And this is my drawing of the church we built. It's not a very good drawing, is it? And that's the church we built, but the church is okay. And it tapers in plan and section. And it connects with the people because it's like a longhouse. And I designed it with my uncle, who's a missionary up there. And one weekend we went away and we came back and these young kids were laughing and their parents were there, and I looked down and I saw all the bricks that we'd thrown out laid on the ground. And I thought to myself, different sensitivity, no waste. Big lesson. And these were my clients, the pastor, his wife and kids. And you know, I went back to Australia, this is an absolutely true story. And anyone that's been to Papua New Guinea will know this. I went back to Australia and I got married, and I didn't have any kids to start with. And so this couple had a kid for me. And they phoned up one day, and it was expensive to phone up, and they couldn't afford it, and they said, "We've got a child for you." And I said, "Oh, I've just had one." True story. And they said, "Oh, well, we'll keep it." And as I was coming back from Papua New Guinea, I could only afford to fly to Cairns, so I flew to Cairns, and I hitchhiked from Cairns down to Sydney. And as I got to Taree, I remember that an old school friend, Nick Gilbert, had started a nursery in Taree. And I thought, if I see a sign or something, I'll stop and go and see him. And just as I thought that, there's a blue sign on the road with black writing, Gilbert's Wholesale Nursery. I asked the guy to stop the car, got out of the car, walked up the driveway with my Swiss backpack, canvas, idealistic, very heavy. And I got to this old shed, and Nick walked out. You know, he didn't look like that, he looked quite scruffy, as he always does. He's a wonderful man. And he walked out. He said, "I was just thinking about you." I mean, I hadn't seen him for 3 years. I've been in New Guinea for 2 years. I was just thinking, "I want to do a house. Can you do it for me?" I said, "Yeah, I think I can fit that in." So I went up and I designed the house and I built it with him. But it was quite scary because he used to come down with a chainsaw and would cut up a beautiful tallowood post with it. We put water on the roof. You can see there's a copper line on the roof there, no gutters, and we drained the water down on the ground. We caught in a big dam and we pumped it back up to the house for fire protection, but also for cooling. And cross ventilation, we had rooms to the north, which were living rooms, to the south, which were like bathrooms and stuff. It was another attempt doing a building that suited its place. Came back to Sydney and started working with builders. These guys were apprentices when I met them, and then they ended up building 5 or 6 of our houses. The guy on the left-hand side is a very cranky guy, but a wonderful person. And he's currently building my own house, and I was with him 2 days ago discussing the foundations and how we're going to form them up. And he's teaching my son, who's in his year off from architecture, how to build. And I travelled a lot in those years between 1980 and 1990. Stayed a lot in Japan with Ponta-san, a great friend of mine, and she was also a tea ceremony exponent. And we used to sit down at night time and she'd present tea ceremony. And I'd never realised how long it could take to serve a cup of tea. But it taught me a really good lesson. There's value in time. Came back and built our own house, which was not dissimilar to some of the buildings in Papua New Guinea, I must say. But one of the things about the house is its value system, that it wasn't really enclosed. It was sort of like an open pavilion that you hung out in. And then we won a competition which was a round-the-world ticket, which I chose to go to Africa and study Indigenous architecture in Africa. So we got to Kenya and hitchhiked down through to South Africa, staying in villages on the way, and particularly this village in Swaziland where we stayed for like 6 weeks. And while we were there, rather than just sitting and looking and taking, we helped them build a kitchen. For anyone that hasn't been to a place like this, it's sort of what nurtures your soul, really. Came back and had no work, 1990, and I phoned up Ken Israel, who I'd designed a building for, and I said, "Ken, what are you up to?" He said, "I was just about to start building that house." And I said, "Well, can I help you?" So with a couple of students, we built this house, which was our first house that got an award. And it got a Robin Boyd Award eventually, and it was judged by Louise Cox, who we're talking about today. And I could tell you a funny story. I probably should, to get you all laughing. She came down that rock ledge there, and she didn't want to visit this house at all. She's actually a very good friend now, so I'm sure she wouldn't mind. And she stumbled across that walkway there and she's grumbling, "Oh, well, why are we here?" And anyway, Ken, beautiful Ken, who's a macrobiotic sort of king of Sydney, brings her in, gives her a cup of batch of tea, and the jury sort of settled in there, and after about 40 minutes, someone wants to leave. It's quite a beautiful place. Ken once said to me, "I don't want anyone working on this house that doesn't have a song to their soul." And I went, "Oh yeah, a song to their soul." But he was right. The house has a song to it, because he had the right people working on it. Anyway, they didn't want to leave, but they had to leave, so they came across, and Louise was in high heels, which is not a good thing to do on this rock ledge. She gets to the rock ledge and steps up and starts to fall, and I grab her, but I grabbed her in the wrong spot. Maybe it was the right spot, because we got an award. And your son does drawings of your buildings, and they're a lot better than your drawings. And this whole thing of passing down is very important, and we've lost that understanding. 4 things for me in architecture, and probably a lot more, but 4 primary: space and light, connection, structure, and the hardest one of all, mood. I'm not sure that you can actually plan for mood. What do you reckon? You elders at the front. It just sort of happens or it doesn't. You can do your best. But I had a great sort of training from my dad, who was an engineer and built power stations. Built them down here, built them in New South Wales, built them in Western Australia. So there was a strong engineering training, and there was also a strong sort of rural training of buildings. And all these buildings, rural and engineered and sort of industrial buildings, are very direct. They don't muck around. They are what they are, which I like. I mean, I think for me that was good. And things are done because they need to be done. So if a door's going to weather or if the timber's going to rot, you put a little flashing over it to protect it. You don't muck around with that, and you'll see that later in one of our buildings. And if you're going to watch the pictures, why don't you have a big canvas chair in the open under the stars? We used to have these all around the country, but as soon as air conditioning came, we lost them. And how many tins of rubbish, skip bins of rubbish, do we have outside our jobs these days? I reckon someone with a bit of innovation and now could actually make a business out of building from the skip bins. And we used to camp on site to do a building, because I don't believe you can do a building without knowing where you're doing it or who you're doing it for. In 1988 and 89, I taught at Sydney University. Then in 1999, Newcastle University asked me back, because that's where I went to be educated, and said, "Will you teach?" I said, "Of course I will." Because in order to keep it, you've got to give it away, which is what the great Aboriginal elder friend of mine says. In order to keep it, you've got to give it away. It's very easy once you start doing that. And then in 2000, Lindsay Johnson, who was head of school with the curly hair there at Newcastle, he said to me, "Pete, they've cut my job out. I can't be head of school anymore." I said, "Why not, Lindsay? You're doing a great job." He said, "Because I don't have a doctorate." I said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Yeah, I don't have a doctorate, so I can't be head of school." So he said, "Can we start something else?" I said, "Well, what do you want?" He said, "Well, why don't we start a masterclass? Ask Rick and Glenn if they'll join in." And then Britt started with us like 3 years later, and we'll see how we go. Glenn said, "I'll do it for a year," 15 years ago. And this is where we do it. No computers. And we teach by drawing. Drawing from the landscape, drawing from people, drawing from life. These are some of my drawings, just to show that I can draw. And we have wonderful Uncle Max Dulamunmun, who's a Yuin elder. He's about 81 years old. He was a timber logger as a kid. He used to run after the trucks, the timber trucks, as they were going up the hill at Bega, and jump on the back so he could get a free lift into town. He used to camp on the river at Bega there under the bridge with all the other Aboriginals on the riverbank. He showed me where he used to walk from Cooma through to Bega. He showed me the track. He's doing welcome to ceremony here, welcome to country, where you remove what you've known through sight, through hearing and through voice, and you're welcomed into their country as one of them. Very noble thing to do. And these are our new teachers. So if you've got a question, you just ask them. They've got the answer immediately. And the only problem I've got with these guys is that when you hug them, you don't get a lot back. So there's no emotion. There's no spontaneity. And this is what's happening in our lives. We've been fortunate enough to do lectures all around the place and run masterclasses. We've just come back from a masterclass in Vermont, one in India, and staying in China. This one's in Hyderabad in India. It's fortunate to have the Louis Barragan Chair in Mexico for a month. This is in Namibia, in the desert in Namibia, where we had a whole lot of students. And that was a rock platform that had fallen down from the adjacent rock, and Rick said to the students, that makes a great stage there. Got up and they started singing. All the African students, it was fantastic. It's been a really rich process, lecturing in Scandinavia, all through Scandinavia. This is Oslo. Being exhibited in GA in Tokyo every year for the past 10 years. Masterclass in Ireland with Yohani Plasma, who's back to us there on the left-hand side. Classes in Taiwan. And doors are open to really amazing places. And you get to hear the real story about falling water. The fact that the people that were looking after falling water were having parties when Kaufman wasn't there. In fact, they were running a bordello. And he turned up unannounced one day, and one of the patrons came out and said, "Excuse me, sir, can I help you?" He said, "You certainly can, this is my house." Ooh. Nova Scotia, Ghost Studio, which was the oldest running masterclass in the world up until 3 years ago. Now Glenn Murcutt masterclass is. Telluride in Colorado, Rick with his hat on, with the indigenous people in Chile, running a small masterclass at Temuco. Early one of our houses, and all I'm going to talk about with our buildings is the key lessons from each building. Otherwise we'd be here and we'd miss out on the drinks tonight and all that sort of stuff. The key lesson on this building, which was done in 1989 roughly, was the veranda and the reinstatement of the veranda. We put that bit of polycarbonate next to the building so we could get the light in, so the veranda didn't pinch all the light from the house. But the people lived on the veranda. They were there like most of the time. And because we made doors that lifted up on a pivot and opened to the veranda entirely, it was like one big room. And that's where they spent most of their time. This is a building that was won by competition at Newcastle University. First competition we won. It's the design faculty, 2,000 square metres. It won the National Environmental Award because it was naturally heated and cooled. And it's designed to put the students on the sunny side of the building and the teachers on the cold side of the building, so that the teachers had to go over to the students. And about 18 months ago, the new board at Newcastle called me up and said, "We're going to have to put air conditioning in your building." And I said, "That's a shame, you know, it used to work really well." And they said, "Well, that's the way it goes." I said, "Can you show me where you're going to put it?" So they took me over to the building. You can see those vents, there's three vents on each roof. I went over there and it was hot in the building, but I walked over and I pulled the cord on the 3 vents and the whole building just cooled down. And they looked at me and they said, "What'd you do then?" I said, "I just opened the vents." The air conditioning never went in. Because we took cool air from down below where the thermal mass was, and we took it straight through the building and we cooled the whole building. Very easy, very fundamental. And then we did a house at Watson's Bay, our first big house. I did like about 100 drawings for the design of this house, and I couldn't work it out. I didn't know where I was heading. And one day my builder and his painter came into the office and they're looking through the drawings, and I said to the painter, "Which one do you like?" He said, "The simple one." I said, "That's the one." Drew it up, was so exhausted, arrived at this place to present and fell asleep on the lawn. The clients turned up and stood over me like this, and they thought, "What have we got here?" This guy's meant to be presenting, he's asleep on the front lawn. Anyway, we built the house. The beautiful spring trusses designed, well, we designed them, but Max Irvine engineered them. a trom wall on the right-hand side that delivers 56 degrees Celsius heat to a 10,000 litre tank in the basement. We use heat pump to heat and cool the house. And opening panels on the ridge there that change the light conditions in the house but also allow you to get sunlight in the southern side and heat the thermal mass. 400 square metres, no heating or cooling in Sydney. But that's the sort of way we think about a building. We think about it on site, we think about how it performs, and that's how we design it. I mean, that's all I know. And the wonderful thing that the client said when she saw it, the woman client, she said, "Oh, this building's beautiful. The walls of this building are the walls of the site." And we came second in the competition for the Snowy Mountains Visitor Centre. But I quite like the design. And it's remarkable how we all know that our designs reappear along the way. We should never be fearful of throwing a design out because they re-emerge at some stage in some shape or form. Probably a lot better. There's a little building in Kangaroo Valley that is completely recyclable, dismantleable. And that was the experiment, but also it lifts its lid to the escarpment, to the sun, and that drops it down to the, so you can heat it really quickly. But the big thing again was the outside veranda and living on the undercover space. Students have often asked me, you know, how do you design a building? I'm not really sure how you design a building, but I think research is part of it. I think doing a lot of research helps you design a building. And we were designing the archery centre for the Olympics. And it was a landfill site, so it moved about 150 millimetres every 6 metres. So I thought of the centipede, like you've got fixed bits and you've got moving bits that accommodate movement. And then I went to Swan Lake Ballet one night, and the ballet dancers lie down on their backs and they all move their feet like this in sequence. I thought, what a lovely form for a roof. So the roof of archery came from that. And it's a twisted roof, but it's separate from the building because if there is movement, you don't want the roof and the building connected because it's all over the shop. And it twists up to the northeast because that's where our cooling breezes come from, but it changes the space underneath as well. And it changes the light conditions, especially if you take the ceilings out from the pods and you drop the light into the pods themselves. And the changing eaves line is really good because what they do then is they can organise the arches in different heights so they have the same relationship with the eaves line, which makes it very fair. And that's where you have your joining piece and your ventilation. So that actually is a bit of concrete that sits on the pad of the other bits of the modules. The modules are 6 metres square and they can be lifted out with a crane. And the joining pieces are, actually the modules are 5 metres square and the joining pieces are a metre. And you get light coming in through the security of the ceiling. And there on the right-hand side, there's that little flap that was on the door earlier on. Pinched the idea from the old shearer. And we use the same roof on a building, a house. But the big lesson in this house, it was designed as a warehouse, which worked really well. And it was designed with an outside kitchen because they were chefs and cooks. And they motivated me to think about cooking in such a way that I thought if the kitchen's outside, then they'll cook out there a lot. And they did, and they do. The mistake I made is I should have put a roof on it. And they cook out there even more. You make a mess, it's just outside. And I know Melbourne climate is different and all that, but still there's something in there. And the roof twists, so you get an uneven parallelogram, so you lap the sheets. And you develop a standard door system and you put them between the columns and then you put white perspex there to take up the difference. That becomes your lighting system. And we won a competition at Newcastle University. They gave us a site that was had a huge study on it, 56-page study, and it was a competition between 4 big firms, and we were with Suitors Architects. And I went to the site and said, it's the wrong site for this building. We changed the site and presented and won. We've always got to think for ourselves as architects. It's really, really important. And we did this precast concrete building, 5,000 square metres, life sciences, biological science building. We put all the services on one side of the building, on the east side of the building, and we made access to those services. So as you're working in the lab, if something needs to be done, you don't shut the lab down. You just go to the side of the lab on the walkways and you service the building. And we did spring water as well, which was a bit of a backlash against that curved truss one, which took so much time and energy. I think in total it's like 560 drawings, hand drawings. And this one was like 5. And I think it's just as good in a different way. I spent a lot of time on site, but you know, it's really just a concrete tent on the side of the hill overlooking the harbour. But it's quite nicely done. And all we've done with the concrete tent is we've just infilled it with off-the-shelf items like chicken louvers and standard door systems and things like that. And so what resonates when you're there is the strength and the clarity of the concrete, and everything else is secondary. It's just like a cave on the side of a hill. And on the left-hand side, the client, who is one of the great clients of the world, he said to me, he's about this high and he's a Chinese Malay, a doctor. He left his family, who were a royal family in Malaysia, and came here with nothing. He didn't want anything, and he set up his own practice and got on his feet again. He said, "Pete, I just want your best contemporary work." And I went, "Oh, is that all? No worries." But he did say, "I've got an amazing art collection and I need to display it somewhere, preferably in a long corridor or something like that." So on the left-hand side there, you can see some art. So you look from the living area across the courtyard to his art room, which is his bedroom. So I made a 3 metre wide, 7 metre high, 14 metre long bedroom for him that put all his art in, so he can sleep with his art. There it is over there. There's an outside kitchen, and there's a sort of room that opens and shuts in the landscape. There's his granddaughter playing grand piano. And there's looking across the courtyard at the art gallery. This is the Aboriginal Cultural Centre. The last competition we did at Newcastle University, and we actually retired from Newcastle University after this because we thought we'd done enough buildings. This was one with Rick LaPlastria, who's my teacher, and Sue Harper, who I taught. So 3 generations of architects. Wonderful thing, I was thinking today, it's a wonderful thing to share architecture with other people. So you actually develop relationships with other firms when you need to. So I don't need to expand my firm because I can work with another firm when I need to. And likewise with Rick. The Aboriginal clients were wonderful because they said to us, what we need is a big house. We don't want an educational building. We want a central room where the community can meet, in which we can teach and have eldership in. We want a fireplace in that room. We want an outside kitchen. I'm going, oh, this sounds good. Every room from every teacher must have access to the outside. We don't want any air conditioning, and we don't want any front door. We want multiple doors so people feel welcome and know where they are. Interesting brief. And so it's passively heated and cooled. Those green things in the floor are vents from below, where you take the cool air from the rammed earth walls down below through the building. And it's passively heated as well because it's all facing north. The lesson on this building was that the family that owned this bit of land, which is just near the coast, was a very strong, layered family, and they all lived on this site in tents. But the parents wanted to build a house where they could be more permanent on the site. And they said, we're back and forth to the beach all the time and everyone's hanging out and running around. And I said, well, you know, what you need really is an outside house. And they said, well, how do you do that? And I said, well, if we build some walls, which are the ones you're looking at, and we put all the services like the bathrooms, kitchens, all that sort of stuff in there, you can actually live on the outside. And then we'll open the main kitchen living area onto that and we'll live in the courtyard, which is exactly what they do. And I think, for me, courtyards are our missing ingredient. As I travel around the world and I look at ancient archaic architecture, courtyards were universal. And we've lost them as a way of thinking, but they are so important. This has a front courtyard, which is like a veranda, which is a house overlooking the harbour at Newcastle, facing north. But when you face north, you get a southern side, which is cold and wet and damp. So if you put a glass roof on that southern side, you happen to be below ground because there's a height restriction of 1.5 on the side. And as soon as you go in the ground, you know you're going to have a wet wall of sorts. So why not make that the bathrooms on the right-hand side of the wet areas? Put the glass roof on the space which happens to be a back walkway area that has big tables in it now, and that's where they eat. Heat it up in winter, so drop some bones down in winter, use the glass roof to heat it. And in summer have mist sprays at each garden at each end and cool it. So now this is the most used room in the house. And the bathrooms are on the right-hand side, which you can see just there. So they walk across the walkways from their bedrooms under the glass roof over to the bathrooms. And the bathrooms just have batten walls on them. Bangalore, which is in Kangaroo Valley, is a building that again has a covered room right in the middle there, which they live in. So all sorts of climates accommodate this sort of living. But it's connected at every facade to its place. On the left-hand side, it opens up to the mountain. On the right-hand side, it drops down to the bad weather from the west and the winds. On the northern side here, it only has the veranda where it needs it for summer sun. And on the southern side, it's all thermal mass. And it opens on courtyards over a gully. So it's the silent side of the house. On the left-hand side, you can see the courtyards there with the walls and the gully on the left. So this building, of all our buildings, is the one that most connects with place. And there's something quite sort of uplifting when you go into a house and you can see further than the house itself, I think. There's something quite sort of beautiful about that you're actually feeling where you are. And of course, I think one of the hardest things in architecture is knowing when your design's right, knowing when the drawing is the drawing that you're going to work on for the rest of the project. So this drawing, as innocent as it is, was the drawing that I did as I was driving down the south coast, and I said, that's the drawing for Paddock House. And someone looked at it and said, what drawing? But that drawing is telling me that there's two central walls inside which is all the thermal mass. So it's the library, it's the laundry, it's the bathroom, it's the kitchen, it's everything. And then on either side, one side is living on the sun side of the house and the other side is sleeping. And it's that simple. And it was built very light framed. It was built for about 1,800 square metre. It was prefabricated and brought onto site under the two walls. So one side is high and one side is low. Very simple framing, very straightforward building. And then you take that experimentation and that thinking into another area, which is like if I put a standard frame up and you're still experimenting with structure because you've developed a two-post system and two-beam system and flat plate steel. So structure is still sort of part of your thinking in a flat roof. If you change the form under the flat roof, then you get a veranda. So you put a triangular form under a rectangular roof, you get negative spaces, which are your veranda. It's very economical. This was 1,900 a square metre. And then because it's such a sort of straightforward fibre cement building, you put big blades on the right-hand side that let the sun in winter and keep it out in summer and cross-ventilate it, and that's it, that's the story. And then suddenly it becomes the architecture because hopefully you've got a bit of a touch after that as well. And these early drawings are really important, these drawings that tell you what you're thinking and how you're thinking and why you're thinking. And there's a big forest on the top of the drawing there, but that's north, so that's where all the shade is. So that's where you want to be in summer, but it's not where you want to be in winter. And like I lived in a house that was on the south side of the hill in Sydney. It was a little fibro shack that we bought in 1980, me and my brother. And in winter, it was freezing cold. And I realised that architecture is also about comfort. Not just emotional, spiritual comfort, it's about physical comfort. And if buildings aren't, to a degree, comfortable, they're not going to be nice to be in. I mean, they'll be okay and they'll be interesting, but they won't be comfortable. So this one here, because we lifted the building off the ground because it was a floodplain and you could feel the water in the ground when you walked on the site. So I didn't want that water in the house as a notion, as a feeling. So we lifted it off the ground and we made, on the left-hand side there, big structural blades that bounce the light into the building from the north. The covered room's in the middle there, so it's now repetitive in our work, the covered room. It's the main room in the house now. And the building sits above the ground, allows the kids to play underneath it, and thermal mass on the left-hand side. But again, I say, there's no point doing all this sort of sustainable stuff unless you make architecture as well. So you bounce the light off those blades into the single loaded corridor. You open the bathroom, not the toilet, but the bathroom onto the covered room and the kitchen and the living area, because you're a family and no one's invading your privacy unless they come in. So you can live like that. You don't have to live with the bathroom separate. You know, if someone's having a bath, e.g. the kids, you can keep an eye on them while you're cooking. And then we did the shearing shed. And if I hadn't visited the site, the shearing shed site, I would never have known that wind changes direction because of Mount Albert in the background. So we were able to reorientate the shed according to the wind. What happens with this shed is that the owner of the property has a beautiful, antique, old heritage shearing shed, but it didn't work. He called me up one day, he said, it's 38 outside and it's 45 inside the shed. I need to reduce the temperature of the shed. This building, of all the buildings we've done, is exactly what it needs to be environmentally and physically. Its aesthetics come out of that. I think we have to have a touch in how we do it, but you know, this is an interesting building in that sense for me, because it's precise and accurate. And I would, you know, I don't think it could be challenged at many levels in that sense. So the screens on the left-hand side have water running down them, and the air goes through that and cools the building. There are 6 sprinklers on the roof from water caught in a dam, and we take the cool air from under the building, because it's always in shade, that ground, so it's cooler, and bring it past the shearers. We reduce ambient temperature by 10 to 14 degrees Celsius. In winter, we take the heat from the sheep, like we're all giving off heat now, we take the heat from the sheep and we bring it across and blow it onto the shearers. We increase temperatures by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. The walls drop down to the south because that's where the bad weather comes from. We store 2,000 sheep under the shed. The initial drawing is, again, very important. It puts the water on the cold side of the building. It puts the shearers' recreation area on the morning side of the building, because that's when they most need the sun. It shows that loading, we increased efficiency by 25%. We don't need any mechanical loading of the trucks. The shearers are the hardest working people I've ever met, and I've been brought up with shearers. They run a property and then they shear from like 7 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, back-breaking business. Great guys. So the water runs down onto the salt bush. The sheep can eat the salt bush, but the wet salt bush catches the dust from the yards. The cross ventilation comes through the chicken shed louvers that we used on spring water as well, etc., etc. That's the lowered ceiling that catches the heat from the sheep and takes it across to the shearers and blows it down with those 2-way fans which are operated by a generator. And the cool air is taken from under the building. There was not one complaint from our clients. The sheep. I didn't think you got that. The shearers call this building the resort. The Aramax roof, as you probably all know, spans 20 metres and cantilevers 5. We used it as structure, self-supporting, and it supported our ceiling systems. It was invented by a farmer from Orange. We're now working with him on a prefabricated building for the Aboriginal people in Arnhem Land, based on this as a wall and roof system. We did a building facing south on Whale Beach, which has one of the best views in the world, but actually one of the coldest sites because it faces south and it's below the road. So we used a roof system to bring the light in. We designed the roof system so it kept the summer sun out and let the winter sun in. But in order to do that, you had to make a big room so that it was competent light, and then make boxes underneath that room, which is what we did. So the thinking led to the architecture. We then have big ventilators up the top, so when it gets too hot, the whole big room can be evacuated of hot air, and it cools down within about 15-20 minutes. We did a cardboard house for House of the Future on the forecourt of the Opera House. There were 6 different materials that were used. No research, there's no tabulated research on cardboard, so we had to do all that ourselves for 2 months. It's in the university with Cole James. And then we built this little house, 65 square metres for $18,000, completely recyclable. We had enormous interest from aid people abroad in terms of hurricane and cyclone relief, but unfortunately Visy in Melbourne wouldn't support us, so we couldn't go ahead with it. We came down and had a meeting with them. This is the airport hangar that further developed the use of that material, which is a self-spanning material. And we reduced structure in this building by 56% because you've got no secondary structure. And therefore we reduced costs by about 30%. So still experimenting. And they call this affectionately the prawn, which I take offence at. No, not really. But you can see there we used one of the sheets as the gutter and just hung it off the bottom. And then cliff face houses on the side of a cliff, and we put it down below the road. All the adjacent houses are above the road. So we put it down and all the neighbours said thank you very much. So they suddenly got a view of the water. But it also got us away from the noise of the road and meant we could use the cliff as the back wall. And when you use the cliff as the back wall, you've got an aesthetic, you've got an enormous thermal mass as well, and you've reduced the amount of building you can do. So the builder's price went down by about 10%. And we have God to thank for that. And we used the wall, you can see the gap there between the floor and the cliff face. We had to cut the cliff face because it had been damaged, and we're walking on it there, so we've got a path on it there to some rooms. But it's a wonderful thing. You walk into this building and you feel like you know where you are. And then once you reach the top of the building, you reach the sky. So there's 3 levels. There's the ground level, which connects with the bay. There's a mid-level that connects with the cliff face. And there's the top level, which connects with the sky. And then we put copper screens, perforated copper screens on so they could manage the light off the water from the west. Contour house, which is based on a strong contour line, is a strong structural wall to the west. It's a thermal wall, and I could go into that, but the main thing about contour houses, it was for 2 families. So the families were either in, the living was in the middle, so it's becoming a communal house, this house. And the corridor, instead of being a corridor, is a room. It's got bed alcoves in it. You can see one there in the foreground. It's now got studies and storage in it as well. So changing the corridor from a corridor to a place was a big lesson. And then we won a competition in Russia, and these were our clients. And as you can see in that photo, they weren't the easiest of clients. In fact, communicating with the clients was incredibly difficult. And the best we ever got was a grunt from the guy on the right-hand side and a smile from the lady on the left-hand side and a smile from the lady on the right-hand side. But they served great dinners. And we built a house which was a environmental building for minus 38 degrees Celsius, and we won it by national competition. And we took guidelines from the old traditional houses in Russia and Sweden, which had a big thermal fireplace wall, and the monasteries in which they cooked. But the heat was held in that central place and regenerated at night time, or re-radiated. So we made a central wall, put the light fittings, all the power, all the hot water systems, all the pipes, all the showers, all the stoves into the wall, along with some thermal mass, some rocks that we got, which were thermally rated. And we held the heat in the wall, recycled 98% of the heat in the building. And this twisted roof meant that the heat goes up to one place and you catch it and put it back down into the floor and put it into the wall. And we took the heat off the car and we put it into the building as well. And I said to the office that if we win this competition, we'll go to Japan, which was a really silly move. Because all the money we won in the competition went into Japan, which was fine. So we went to see this building, which was opened in Japan several years ago, or a few years ago, which is a house-potential small museum for a fashion designer in outside Tokyo. And this is, we always do a hand drawing as our first presentation. This is the initial hand drawing of the plan only. And this fellow taught me a serious amount about design. We started here, and he took the design all the way around here, up to here, across, down, over here, back to here, and then he said, now Peter, we're back to the origins. And we'd lost about 15% on the way. It was a great lesson. And we worked with these three wonderful people. The guy on the left-hand side has become quite a famous Japanese architect, and his workmate Honda. The guy on the right-hand side was the intermediary who could speak English, French and Japanese. And I saw him this morning, and he's just graduated from final year architecture at UTS, and he was a fashion designer when I met him. But because of this building, he went and studied architecture in Australia. Lots of models. The idea was we built a strong wall to the street, to the urban street. This is where that ramp occurs that I showed you in the landscape. And then we built lightweight buildings off that wall. Some of them are sky buildings on the left-hand side, and some of them are ground buildings. Very simple idea. But it's all about the courtyard that you make and the street, the urban street. And there's a samurai house and a geisha house that are associated with this building, so it's a trilogy of buildings. But because the street is where the sun was, there's that ramp that I was talking about, where the sun was. I wanted to get sunlight into the building. We had 86 degrees Celsius water from thermal springs that we could use to heat the building and cool with a heat pump. But it was the sunlight in winter. So I just lifted the roof off the thermal mass, off the concrete, put a skin of water there and bounced sunlight into the building. From the street side, the urban street, you see buildings adjacent to this one, adjacent to the wall, into the lightweight pavilion on the left-hand side that changes with the light. A twisted roof which takes the humid air out of the building through those ventilated windows. But it also picks up on the diagonal of the site, and it also increases the length of the building because it's diagonal, not a rectangle. All the services on the left-hand side, calligraphy ink in the concrete, light fittings all the light fittings and tap fittings and sinks and that we designed ourselves. This light fitting here is where the door closes on the wall, and the covered room. All the door systems slide outside the building, so the front building just becomes a pavilion in the landscape, and the back building shuts down with canvas screens. Bathhouse at either end. Connection with the samurai house and the garden. Water bringing the sky into the building. Single skin timber walls. Doors all slid to one end of the building and the other. Building in Seaforth, which is the clients came to me, and they're old clients that did building for them 25 years ago, that came to me and they said, can we have a dining room? But I'd worked with them before and I knew that they could accommodate things. So I thought, why don't we have a dining room in the garden? And they said, well, can you make it so we could seal it if we had to? I said, sure, we'll allow for a couple of canvas blinds, which we did, but we've never put them in. They fortunately ran out of money before we got to the canvas blinds. We know how to spend money. So here's the garden, here's the courtyard. That's a little renovation, that's a little upturned roof, on the back of the building. You see it kicks up there, we did that. So we did about 2.5 metres on the back of the building, which is here. We made some portal frames to connect the structure all the way through, visually and physically. Put a covered walkway on the right-hand side where you enter the house and an open one on the left-hand side, and made a courtyard and a herb garden on the left. And the dining room's in the distance there, just there. Looking up to the old building we did, which is a design studio 25 years ago. And I would say that 7 out of 10 times when I go to visit, because they're very good friends, they're sitting out in the dining room. I promise. Invisible House, which is on the escarpment overlooking Megalong Valley. Tough, tough, tough site. Westerly winds that hammer the site, sou'westers that bring the snow, easterlies that when they come they really thump it. It needed to be a tough building. We recycled all the timber we used on that curved roof as the ceiling. This building was built by one builder who did all the work himself. He had 2 apprentices. He only had an electrician and a hydraulic guy to help him. He did all the steelwork, all the concrete, all the timber. Took him 3 years and 3 skip bins of waste. It's an isolated site. So this is the formwork for that curved roof that we used as the ceiling lining, turned it upside down. We had fans in this ceiling to blow the hot air down. The reason for these boxes on top is actually to scoop the northern sun in because it's facing east. And then on the right-hand side, we use them for bedrooms and bathrooms. The skin of water on the roof reflects the sky because you enter this building from above, so the building appears like it's not there. And the boxes themselves sort of reflect the ridge lines in the distance in a funny way, in a sculptural way. Big thermal wall in the middle of the building, big stone archaic wall. It's like walking into a ruin, this building, which I like. I like the idea that you walk into a building, you feel it straight away, or you feel what it might have been or could be. And then we recycled all the formwork as stairs and joinery in the building. So that's all recycled formwork. This is a building we've just finished. It's actually a remarkable brief. The guy who this building is for came to me and he said, I want you to build me a house, but I want you to build it knowing that it's going to be a museum that I'm going to give to the nation in the future. He's got one of the greatest Asian art collections I've ever seen. And so the whole building was designed around his Asian art collection that he's going to give to the nation in the future. It's Reg Livermore's old 5-acre site in the Blue Mountains. So the whole courtyard on the right-hand side is a sculpture courtyard that you enter from the street, where the public will enter eventually. And the house is a gallery. And the structure of the house is something of an experiment. They're big columns, but they've got all our services in them. They've got hydronic heating in them as well. And they've got vents in them that pull the hot air down. It's in cold Katoomba. But they're also the same size as all the joinery. So when you put the joinery in, it marries in with your column system and it doesn't detract from the whole structural system of the building. And our latest house is a house on the wonderful pediment of stone, which is North Head. And it sits on North Head. And I don't like the way houses sit on North Head because I think they crowd it. So we lifted the building off North Head, off the wonderful pediment of stone that is North Head. It was 400 feet down. But we still wanted it to be horizontal as a band, and it had to be really durable because it's in one of the worst weather conditions in Sydney. But it needed to be a soft form as well because I felt the hard forms in that place were not really all that pretty. So there it is sitting in its urban landscape against the cliff face. And there it is in elevation. And so it's two horizontal concrete plates, which is really quite simple. But in doing that, you create a singular space. So we've used skylights to change the space underneath. So we've got these plywood serviettes that drop down and raise up in the space and change the nature of the space in the upper level. And the lower level is all free of rooms so that you actually see the pediment of rock, but you also can move from place to place depending on the weather. So you actually live on the lower area garden, which is on the left-hand side, so a series of 3 or 4 courtyards, and your bedrooms are upstairs. And I'm very keen on discovering simple elevations. And it's copper, concrete and glass, so it never has to be touched. And the upper form is the veranda for the lower form. And that pool there is a plunge pool, but it's also a register for the sky. So that's a through skylight that goes all the way to the sky. So if it's raining, you see it in the pool. Like there on the left-hand side. And if it's clouds are passing over, you also see it. And it's a private courtyard. And it has edges that are very fragile, except when they're shut. And that's the only room on the lower level. All the columns are sized according to their seismic loading. So they're all 3 different sizes. The biggest one is 900 and has all our services and switching and everything in it. And the smallest one is 300. So when you look at the building, you can read its seismic loading through its structural system. That's the back of that module, and because it's only single skin timber, because we've used the same philosophy with our lining as with the cladding, and when you curve a board, much easier to curve a single board than a double, so all our linings are single skin timber, which means all our surfaces have to be exposed. So you do something with them. We get light from that bathroom that you saw the through courtyard, through skylight on, and there's one of the serviette skylights that are all at different levels and change the building spatially. We used woks in the ceiling to make our light fitting places. And then it's not shown here, but we then enamelled the woks and used them as light fittings. There's a tall and a short person in this house. We just put a copper skin where the wet areas are, and we use red light for privacy. That's your through skylight, but it's also your ventilation for your bathroom. Hot water pipes for towel rails, that makes sense. Jane Beard did all the sinks, and it was just the same price as buying them off the shelf. And we had to invent some window systems for the particular walls. The owner complained of the moon waking him up at night time, so to do one different skylight. And what I love is the curved line against the horizontal horizon, this hard, straight line. It's beautiful seeing a curved line against that, something I didn't anticipate. And we designed all the furniture. This is the work table. And the couch at the end that sits against it. You can't do great buildings without great builders and great project architects, and I acknowledge them wholeheartedly. John Durham and David Watson, and I love his socks. And along the way you meet some amazing people. Ian Athfield, who died in January, 74 years old. One of the great architects and one of the great raconteurs of architecture in the world. Personal friend, and what a loss. Rick Joy, very close friend, taught with him in Vermont 2 weeks ago. Ran a masterclass with him. Mr. Frampton, who wrote for us in the Gold Medal Tribute, wonderful friend. Always have lunch with him in New York. Nice guy. Doshi, one of the great architects of the world, taught with him last week for a week. Fantastic person, 87 years old. Worked 3 years with Corbusier and 3 years with Kahn. And I sat down and talked to him about it. Can you imagine that, being one off? One off the masters and one on a master? What a privilege we have as architects. Competition we finished, and they still haven't announced, which is a temple in Papua New Guinea. Out of concrete, we layered it. We formed the dome out of layers, horizontal layers of concrete. It's a Baha'i temple which has two prerequisites. One is a dome, and the other is 9 sides. So we tried to simplify that down to the bare minimum. So we put splits or pleats in the building to make the 9 sides. We changed the opening of those pleats to suit the weather and to suit the light we wanted in the building. We cut it into the rock shelf by about 1.5 metres. We put a bed of 200 millimetres of water as the platform it sits on. We put a very fine filigree of timber around the inside so we could make 9 separate chambers. And you can see the scale of it there on the right-hand side. You see the people, 45 metres diameter. And a competition that's almost about to be constructed, which is a 1910 nurses building in Sydney, the new Community Arts Centre, which has heritage listed arches. So I said, well, let's just put some vaults through the arches. And the heritage consultant said, you can't do that. And I said, well, you know, we're not touching the arches, we're just putting some vaults through there. So we're celebrating the arches. He said, oh, I guess we are. You can always talk them into it, I reckon. So we put 7 vaults through the arches like that. We took out the guts underneath the arches, and we made a beautiful big indoor-outdoor room. Very simple idea. And then we put some lovely openings through those arches so we had secondary rooms and a lovely walkway around the void space that we made. And the last building is the building I live in with my partner Fernanda and the kids when they're there. It's a $5,700 tent from South Africa. And the total cost of the building is $38,000. And we've been there for nearly 2 years. And I got rid of a lot of stuff except for the flat screen TV for the rugby. Sucker for that. And there's the kitchen in the distance. Noah, my son, prefabricated kitchen, an experiment in prefabrication. A friend of mine made it, $1,900, the entire kitchen, leather handles, exposed plumbing, the bathroom, single skin walls on a timber frame, all prefabricated, single sheet of thin plywood where you want your services and lighting. We designed our lighting, $35 a fitting, just a bit of pipe cut on an angle. Up in one area, down the others. The pink bath from the old house. So when it gets cold, you get in the pink bath. And the flats next door, who love the fact that we didn't build a big house. Couldn't be done without a great team of people over the years. We all know that. We're indebted to our friends and our colleagues. Phoebe Pape, Richard Smith, Fergus Scott, Professor Max Irvine, all these people, wonderful people, Belinda Koopman. Our current office, this pool is where I swim every morning. Finally the lights are down. Really down. And remember the kangaroo? So this is how we're learning about kangaroos now. Thanks very much.